we get to begin a brand new sermon series in the Minor Prophets. Let's go, Minor Prophets. I feel like there's multiple reactions to that. The Bible nerds in the room are like, all right, let's go. And the normal people, kind of like you and me, are like, I don't know anything about the Minor Prophets. It's sort of an area of our Bible that we feel a little bit intimidated by. We can hardly say the names. Sometimes we skip over it. When we get there in our Bible reading plans, we're like, yeah, I don't know what that word means. It's just like a little bit intimidating. And that's part of why we want to spend time in it, is we want to go back to the Old Testament, spend some time there, and understand some of these minor prophets. So in this little chunk that we have this semester, we're going to cover 4 of the minor prophets. Now you should know in the Bible, there are what we call major prophets and minor prophets. You got the major prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Now the minor prophets are not like the minor leagues, okay? It's not like the minor prophets, decent talent, but if they had just tried harder, they might have made it to the big leagues. That's not what's happening with the minor prophets. They are minor merely by virtue of the fact that they are shorter. And by virtue of the fact that they're shorter, they're a little bit more narrow in their scope. That's what we mean by the minor prophets. It's that little collection of about 12 books right before the New Testament. And we're going to begin today with the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk. Now, Habakkuk is a great illustration of the minor prophets because we can't spell it, we can't say it, we can't find it, and we don't understand it. So let's dive in to see what the book of Habakkuk has to offer us. If you're looking for it in the New Testament, don't be embarrassed to use your table of contents, or just go to Matthew if you know where that is, and hang 5 lefts. Just go to the left 5 times and you'll be right there in the book of Habakkuk. Now, one of the things that kind of confronts us as we approach something like the minor prophets, this is a problem in some way for all of the Bible, but especially the Old Testament, is there exists such a wide cultural gap between us here today and the people and the context and the time in which and to which this literature was written. That cultural gap at times can be confounding and confusing, and at times it can even cause us to ask, like, hey, what's the point of even studying this? Habakkuk was written 2,600 years ago, and we're sending people on rockets into space. Like, what does this book have to say to us? And I'm encouraged to tell you this morning that Habakkuk especially is asking a question that all of us have wrestled with. That the central heartbeat and the question that is going to be through every word of the book of Habakkuk is this. Tell me if you've ever encountered this question, if you've ever wrestled with this question, or if you've ever heard this question. It's this: how can God be good if the world is so full of evil? Anybody ever encountered that question? Anybody ever wrestled with that question in your heart in the dark night of the soul as you've laid awake on your bed and wondered, how could God be in control and be good and my life look like this right now? That is the question that Habakkuk is going to ask and answer. And he had good reason for that to be his question, because Habakkuk, like almost all of the minor prophets, was prophesying in a time when the kingdom of Israel was split. It was divided, and it was on a descent into moral decay and into idolatry and into destruction. In fact, Habakkuk was written about the year 600 or so, which means that after King Saul and King David and King Solomon had reigned, and Solomon's son split the kingdom through his foolishness into the northern tribes of Israel and the southern tribe of Judah, by the time that Habakkuk writes, the Assyrian Empire has already wiped out the northern tribes of Israel. They are gone. They've been sent into exile. They've been in some ways scattered. And yet the tribes of Judah, the 2 tribes that are left in the southern kingdom, they were going through a tumultuous period. They had a king whose name was Manasseh, that the book of 1 Kings tells us is the worst king that reigned in Judah's entire history. In fact, he was so evil and so corrupt that he offered his child in sacrifice to the pagan gods of the Canaanites. Utter corruption and violence and wickedness. Now, Manasseh has a grandson whose name is Josiah. And he comes onto the scene. He becomes king at 8 years old, very young, and he is like a glimmer of hope on this bleak backdrop of darkness. Because as Josiah grows up, he sends some men to refurbish the temple, and in their work, they discover the long-lost scroll of the Word of God. Josiah tears his robes, reads it in front of all of the people, and there is national repentance and revival. And people begin to return to the one true and living God, to tear down the high places of false worship and to begin to trust and follow the Lord, Yahweh, again. And tragically, Josiah is killed in a battle, and the one who succeeded him, his name was Jehoiakim, and he was just as bad as Manasseh. And he plunged the people of God further into chaos as they disobeyed and disregarded the law of God, as they began to worship false gods and idols and pagan deities. The nation is in utter disarray. And over and against all of that internal reality to the people of God, there's this foreboding reality that on the horizon, the empire of Babylon is ascending. Babylon, in fact, was so powerful that they had already conquered the Assyrian Empire that conquered the nation of Israel, the tribes in the north. And so Babylon is on the rise, and they are on the horizon getting ready to come and attack the tribes of Judah. And it is right in the middle of all of that fear and all of that evil and all of those burdens that Habakkuk looks around at the evil of God's people and the danger of God's enemies, and he says, God, do you see what's going on here? Do you see what's happening? Do you care? Are you going to do something about this? That's where his agonized complaint begins. And if we're being honest with ourselves, we have all been there. When we have looked out at the world kind of at a global scale, we have grappled with the difficulty that faces us, with tsunamis and starvation and cancer and poverty and exploitation and wars. And we say, God, don't you see that the world you made has been plunged into chaos? Don't you care? Aren't you going to do something about it? But perhaps even more painful than looking at things on a global scale is the way that we personally and intimately experience the pain of a broken world. It's not just headlines, it's personal experiences. You and I, we experience car accidents and divorce and miscarriage and losing loved ones. And we sit in these moments of pain, and if in fact we belong to God through faith in Jesus Christ, it's like we look up to heaven and we say, God, don't you see what's happening to me? Don't you care? Don't you know I'm hurting? Aren't you going to do something about this? And this is why we need the book of Habakkuk in our Bible. Because as a prophet who cries out to God in the midst of this agony, he is going to hear from God. And God is not going to give him a bite-sized fortune cookie answer to the question. Rather, God is going to faithfully enter into the question with his prophet. And by the inspiration and preservation of the scriptures, he's going to enter into that question with us. As we grapple, as we wrestle with the evil of the world and the pain of our lives, God will enter in and give us an answer to the question. And here's the miracle that we're going to see in Habakkuk through all three of these messages that we're going to preach here, is this. It's not that God snaps his fingers and fixes all the problems. Though we might enjoy if God would do that. God, can you just make it all go away? Rather, what God is going to do is, rather than take away all of our heartache, he is going to provide us a rock-solid, indestructible hope in the midst of the heartache. That is the thesis of the book of Habakkuk, and it's the big idea of the message today, that hope will live within the heartache of God's people. Hope will live. The great courage that you can have as a follower of Jesus is not that you will never experience heartache. It's that when you experience the heartache, when you lose the job, when you are betrayed, when you are abandoned, when you lose the loved one, when you don't know where the next meal is going to come from, when you experience that pain, God will meet you there in a way that gives you a confident expectation of the future because of what God has promised to you. That is what hope is. Hope is not just a warm and fuzzy feeling. Hope is not merely optimism. Hope is a confident expectation for what's coming in my future because of the character and the faithfulness of the God that I know. That's what hope is. And hope lives in the middle of the heartache that God's people face. That's the message that we're going to get this morning. And so I want you to open your ears and your heart to receive the word of God as I read it. This is Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 1. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you, violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you look idly at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. Look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence. All their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on, guilty men whose own might is their God. Are you not from everlasting to everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment. And you, O rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong. Why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet. So he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his dragnet. For by them he lives in luxury and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. Hope will live within the heartache of God's people. But the question that we need to ask and answer this morning as we begin this book is, how does that work? Because it is a nice thing to say, and it is a whole nother thing to experience. And if you're like me, I don't just want to know that that's true in the abstract. I want to experience that in reality. And I want to help you do that by giving you 3 necessary steps to experience hope in the heartache. 3 things we must do if we're going to have the confident expectation that God desires to give to us right in the middle of our suffering. So here's 3 of them. The first one is this: heartache meets hope when, number 1, when I communicate the pain. When I communicate the pain. Verse 1 begins this way: the oracle, many translations have the burden that Habakkuk the prophet saw. Habakkuk is a very interesting book in the prophetic literature because often prophets begin with God's powerful words or God's decisive actions or God's clear commands. But Habakkuk is interesting because it doesn't begin with God. It begins with the prophet, and it begins with something that feels a little bit jarring to us at first. It begins with a complaint. Like, you ever been to a restaurant and they've got a little box that says, you can lodge your complaints here, tell us how to improve? Like, if you've got an issue, you can write it down and you can submit it, and it's as if Habakkuk is going and saying, hey God, I've got an issue. I've got a complaint, and that's where the book starts, is with the pain that he is experiencing because of all that I've already explained about his context and his time and his despair for God's people. He looks around at God's covenant people who received the law of God and who are supposed to be a righteous and holy people, who are set apart for the one true and living God, whose manner of life is supposed to reflect the character of the God that they serve to the watching world, and yet they're living in all kinds of idolatry. They're living in complete injustice, disregard of God's law, denigration of God's holiness, disobedience to God's commands. And that hurts Habakkuk, who is a spokesperson for God, who loves God and knows God, and he's personally and deeply wounded by the rebellion of God's people. And he cries out to God from that place of wounding, and he's like, God, I've been trying to tell you this, and it feels like you're not listening. Do you see what's happening with your people? Do you see the violence and the destruction and the chaos and the evil? And are you going to do something about it? This is the agonized cry with which Habakkuk begins. And what Habakkuk is doing here is he's serving as an example for us of what we should do with the pain that life inevitably brings. Pain is an inevitable byproduct of living in a broken world. There is no situation in which you can live life devoid of pain. It's not possible. Sin and rebellion against God has so scarred this world that pain is an inevitable byproduct. Just like carbon dioxide is a byproduct of breathing. When you take in oxygen, your body uses it, it splits the gases, and you end up with CO2 in your body that you have to exhale so that you don't die. In the same way, when we experience pain in this life, if we just internalize it and bury it and stuff it and pretend like it doesn't exist, it actually becomes poisonous to our souls. We're weak, finite creatures, and we actually need a way that we can give vent to our pain. We need a place we can go with our burdens. And that's what Habakkuk is showing us here, because what he does is he doesn't hold it in, he doesn't gloss it over, he doesn't sweep it under the rug, he gives voice to it. He expresses it. And what I love about this is he expresses it to the one who is most capable to do something about it. You see, I think so often when we experience pain as the people of God, we end up in these situations where what we do is we talk about God instead of talking to God. You ever been there? I know I have. When we have a complaint, we end up complaining about God. We go to our friends or our pastors or our neighbors or our small group, and we just complain about God because my life is hard and there's real struggles in my existence right now, and we complain about God instead of going to God. It's similar to the experience or the expression of gossip. It's almost as if God is up in heaven. He's like, hey, I'm the one you're complaining about, and I'm right here. Why don't you just come tell me? Why don't you come talk to me? Because I'm here and I care and I can handle your complaints. I am willing to hear your pain and meet you there in that moment. One of the reasons I think we don't do that is because we actually kind of feel at some level like it's sacrilegious to go to God with a complaint. Like it's kind of blasphemous to be like, God, where are you? And hear me now, is it possible to approach God in a way that is irreverent with a complaint? Of course it is. If you go to God with an arrogant posture and you go to slander him and attack him, I would advise against that. But that's not what Habakkuk is doing here. What I love so much about Habakkuk is what will become clear the further that we study is that the reason Habakkuk goes to God is because he actually knows that he is good. He goes to God because he believes God cares. That's why his complaint has so much pain in it. If Habakkuk didn't believe that God cared or knew or would do anything about it, we wouldn't have the book of Habakkuk. because he would have never gone to God with the complaint in the first place. He would have just looked around at the world and said, of course this is the way the world is. God either doesn't know or doesn't care or isn't powerful enough or good enough to do something about it. And he wouldn't have written and he wouldn't have prayed and he wouldn't have complained. But Habakkuk knows God. And so he runs to him with his burdens and he unloads his pain to God, knowing that he cares for him. This is what the New Testament calls us to do in the book of 1 Peter. It says, cast your cares upon him. Why? Because he cares for you. He cares for you. So you can bring your cares to him, even when they are full of pain. Habakkuk serves as an example here to us that we must go to God as a statement of our faith, believing that God is good and that he wants to hear from his hurting people. Communicate the pain to God. He can handle it. And he sees it, and he loves you in the midst of it. Heartache meets hope when I, number one, communicate the pain, and number two, heartache meets hope when I learn the providence. When I learn the providence. There is a change of speaker in verse 5. Verses 2 to 4 are Habakkuk voicing his complaint, and then verse 5 begins a response of God. In fact, this is the fundamental structure of the book of Habakkuk, is the prophet lodges a complaint and then God responds. And then it happens one more time. The prophet lodges a complaint and then God responds. And the book culminates in chapter 3 with a prayer of resolution and a prayer of courage and a prayer of hope that Habakkuk prays. But the beginning, the first two chapters are complaint, response, complaint, response. And this morning, we are covering the first two complaints and the first response. But this in verse 5 is God's first word in the book. And at first, when he speaks in verse 5, what he says, it appears so hopeful. Verse 5, he says, look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. And if only verse 5, if he just stopped there, it would be so awesome. Habakkuk's like, God, don't you see this? And God's like, oh, I see it. And if you just lift your eyes, I'm going to do something amazing. And Habakkuk's like, oh, I'm so relieved to hear that. And then in verse 6, God is like, yeah, it's going to be terrible. You're going to hate it. And these verses that we're about to talk about, if you're like me and you feel like you've got a nice, neat little box where your understanding of God fits, where you're like, hey, this is what God is like, and this is how God acts, and this is what God can do and not do, these verses are about to drop a little stick of theological dynamite into your box and blow it to smithereens. Because in verse 6, the thing that he is going to do is jarring. It is confounding. It's a little confusing because this is what God says he's going to do. He says, don't worry, Habakkuk, I see the wickedness of my people and I'm going to bring judgment on them like I promised when I delivered the covenant at Mount Sinai. I'm going to bring judgment, but I am going to use the wicked empire of Babylon as my instrument to do it. And if you're reading along, you're like, what? Are you allowed to do that, God? That feels like it's against the rules. I know we're failing here as your people, but we're better than them. And it's true. Babylon was like the ISIS of the 7th century. They were evil. They were wicked. They were far worse than God's people. And all of the verses that follow after verse 6 are a description of just how evil they are. With their horses and their chariots, they are fiercely and violently tearing down cities and rulers and kingdoms, and they are pillaging and plundering and killing and exploiting, and they're doing it aggressively and assertively and repeatedly. And God says, yeah, those people, I am going to bring them against you as an instrument of judgment. I am going to wield them in my hand like a hammer, and I'm going to use them as a tool. Now, you're thinking to yourself, well, I thought this was a message about hope. This does not sound very hopeful. But here's why we need to understand. Here's what we need to understand here. This is what God is teaching us about here is his providence. This is what we need to learn if we're going to have hope. Because the empire of Babylon was evil. And what they were going to come and do to these tribes of Judah, it's evil. And yet God is so big and so sovereign that he says, I am going to use evil for my good purposes. That statement is just, it's confusing to us. It's mysterious to us. Here's the best way I thought of this week to state the providence of God here. The providence of God here, it means that God is sovereign over evil, but he is not guilty of evil, and he will bring good from evil. That's what we mean by providence here. God is sovereign over evil. He rules over it. It's not outside of his control. But he is not guilty of evil in that he cannot be accused. He is not culpable for the evil that occurs. And he is committed and capable to bring good from evil. And you're like, Nick, can you tell me how those sentences work together? No, I can't. Genuinely, I can't explain all of the intricacies of how that sentence fits together. I just know that the Bible unequivocally reveals all three of those things. He is sovereign over evil, he is not guilty of evil, and he will bring good from evil. And he's telling his wayward nation through his prophet, this is what I'm going to do. This is going to be evil, and yet I'm using it for my good and glorious purposes. Now, why in the world does this bring hope to God's people? Because if you consider the alternative, right? Sometimes what we do to try to let God off the hook theologically is we say, hey, when evil things happen to me, God must not be involved in that. Like the evil things are over here and God's over there. And like maybe he didn't see, maybe he didn't know about it, maybe he wasn't aware, maybe it kind of slipped through his grasp and it got to me and it's just an evil thing, but God doesn't have anything to do with it. And I just want to appeal to you today that if that's how you resolve it in your mind, that God must not be involved in the evil things that happen at all, that, I would argue, is a far more hopeless perspective. Because it means that the universe has run amok. It means that there is no grand design. There is no glorious purpose. There is no benevolent will. There is no kind and good God that is ultimately behind everything that is happening, no matter how hard or difficult. Those circumstances or those bad actors or that evil is just going to have its way with you apart from God. That is hopeless. What is far more hopeful in the midst of the evil and the pain, to build my life on the bedrock truth that God works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Romans chapter 8 and verse 28 is not a cliche. It is not a bumper sticker or a coffee mug. It is like a solid rock upon which you can build your life. And the scriptures testify to this over and over and over again. Think about the culmination of the story of Joseph. Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20. Joseph has been the victim of injustice and evil and wrong at the hands of his brothers. And yet what he says to them is, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. If you stop and you meditate upon what that means for just a moment, it means that what his brothers did in wickedness, God intended to use for his saving and glorious purposes. Which means God's will for the universe and his plans for your life supersede any evil you will come into contact with. And in fact, he will use the evil for your good. This is astounding truth about how big and awesome God is. And it finds its ultimate culmination in the death of Jesus Christ. Consider this with me for just a moment, that the most heinous act of evil that has ever been perpetrated was the murder of the spotless Son of God. There has never been anything more evil than that. And the enemies of God, Acts chapter 4 says that it was Herod and Pontius Pilate with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, all of these people who were gathered against God in this moment, who crucified the Son of God. What Acts chapter 4 says is that they were gathered to do whatever your hand had predestined to take place. Which means that as the enemies of God perpetrated the worst act of evil, they came to find out in the long run they were doing the will of God. And they were accomplishing his ultimate plan for the redemption of all things. So our salvation, the fact that we are no longer separated from a holy God, but we've been made right with him, our salvation culminates in an evil act perpetrated by evil men with evil intentions that accomplished the good and glorious will and plan of our God. Why? Because God is sovereign, and his providence means that he will see to it that everything in this world ultimately accomplishes his good purposes. And that gives us hope in the heartache, because it means not a single thing that you experience in this life is out of God's hands. It means not a single thing that you go through is out of God's sight. It means he sees it all, he knows it all, he oversees it all, and he will use it all for your good and for his glory. That is a God in which you can have hope. A providential God, a sovereign God. Is there mystery there? Absolutely there is. But there is hope. Heartache meets hope when I communicate the pain, when I learn the providence, and last, when I trust the process. When I trust the process. One of the things that makes this so difficult for us is that we live in an instant gratification culture. We want what we want, and we want it now. We want gigablast internet. We want same-day delivery. Just in case there's any delay in my Holy Spirit anointed Christian chicken at Chick-fil-A, give me 2 drive-thrus. Double drive-thru. Teenagers armed to the teeth with iPads and my pleasures. Just as quick as humanly possible. Give it to me, and give it to me now. That's how we live. We just want everything. We want it instant. We want no delay. We want it now. And the reason we get so frustrated is because God doesn't work like that. God doesn't work like that. I have this memory seared into my mind from when I was a young kid. I think I was probably younger than my son Titus is now, who just turned 5. I was with my dad, and he was just on the stage, and if you've ever interacted with my dad, this story will make sense to you. We were at a fast food place, and we were second in line, and the person in front of us, I think he was like a teenager, and he kind of like barked out his order to the fast food worker. And the way that he culminated his order was he looked at the worker and he said, "And make it snappy." And Steve Eli was standing behind him. And we're standing behind this guy, and my dad kind of pauses for a moment, and he looks at me, and I look up at him. And definitely so that this guy can hear what he said, he looked at me and he said, "Don't you ever speak to someone who is serving you like that." And obviously it made an impact, because I still remember it. I think part of our problem is sometimes, if we were honest, when we encounter struggle and burden and pain in this life, when we go to God, we say, "Hey, God, I'd really like you to fix this and make it snappy." Like just fix the problem. Just remove the burden. Just get me out of the situation. And what we come to frustratingly find out oftentimes is that God is actually doing his best work by not removing the burden. It is in the delay that God does heart surgery on his people. When we're like, "God, just give me the instant microwave solution to the problem," God says, "I like crock pots." It's gonna take a little while. This is gonna have to simmer. That's the way that God so often works. There is a process to experiencing hope. There's a reason you don't get a college diploma on the first day of class. There's a reason you don't summit the mountain on the first step of the hike. Why? There's a process. You got to put in the work. There's things you have to do. And on the journey, God will meet you and he will walk with you. And it is no less true in experiencing hope in the midst of our heartache. There is a process. And in Habakkuk's second complaint, we get to see him walk through this process in such a clear and helpful way. And here's the process. What do we do to experience hope? We worship, we wrestle, and we wait. We worship, we wrestle, and we wait. Habakkuk begins with worship. Look at verse 12. It says, "Are you not from everlasting?" Earlier when I read, I said everlasting to everlasting. It's like muscle memory. It just says one everlasting. "Are you not from everlasting? O Lord my God, my Holy One, we shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof." Look at verse 13. "You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong." Habakkuk begins with worship. Now, remember, he is in the midst of the pain. He's already cried out with a complaint. He is feeling the weight of the burden. And yet the first words out of his mouth in this section are, "God, I know you are eternal. I know you are holy. I know that you are my rock. And I know that you are pure." This is where he begins in this complaint. He actually begins with worship. He begins by saying to God things that he knows are true about God. You are good, God. You are faithful. You are true. You keep all your promises. It's where he begins. He begins in worship. And then and only then does he move to wrestling. In the second half of verse 13, he says, "Why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he?" Verse 13 in the beginning is like this metaphor of how completely pure God is, that he can't even look upon evil. And he's holding together these two twin realities. He's like, I know you're so pure that you can't even see evil, but I know you see this evil that's happening. And what is he doing there? He's wrestling. He's worshiped God for how good he is, and now he's grappling with the most difficult questions and the heaviest burdens that face him. And he is going to wrestle. That's in fact what this whole text is here, this little section. He moves on from verse 14 and he tells this metaphor of fish in the sea and a net and the person operating the net. You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook and drags them out with his net. He's using a metaphor of the fish as the people of God and the net and the one who operates it as the nation of Babylon, that they're going to scoop up and kill all of God's people, and then they're going to bow down and worship their net in idolatry. And Habakkuk's like, don't you see that they're going to do this? They're going to destroy us. They're going to swallow us up. They're going to be the end of us. And what is he doing there? He's wrestling with what God has just told him he's going to do with the nation of Babylon. But what I love here is that Habakkuk, he is wrestling after he has worshiped. The order is so important here in this complaint, and I think it's meant to be instructive to us, because Habakkuk, he is coming face to face with his burdens, but what he refuses to do is to develop his view of God through the lens of his burdens. Rather, he does what we all must do, which is he views his burdens through the lens of who he knows God to be. We get in big trouble when we mix that up. You see, the character and nature of God is not determined by our experiences. God is who he is. He is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. He is always the same. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He will never change. His character endures. And so when he reveals himself to us, what he says about himself is true, and it will never not be true. So what we need to do is receive what God's word has said about him. And then as we wrestle, we need to wrestle with an understanding of how God has revealed himself. But yes, we need to wrestle. It is okay. And in fact, it is healthy to agonize and to cry and to call out and to complain and to ask and to wonder. And then as we wrestle, we get to the third part of the process, which is we wait. We wait. Look at verse 1 of chapter 2. Habakkuk says, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. You can sort of imagine the image of like a castle with a tower and the rampart at the top. And he says, like a guard would go up to the top of the tower and set their eyes on the horizon to see what's coming. I'm going to go to my station, I am going to post up, and I am going to open my ears and my heart, and I am going to wait there until I hear from God. I'm not going to budge, I'm not going to move, I'm not going to run, I'm not going to abandon, I am going to wait. What does that mean? He means I'm actually expecting that some time is going to pass. But with this sense of almost like holy stubbornness, he's like, God, you can catch me right here. I'm going to be posted up. I'm going to be waiting for you. I'm going to be listening for you. And God, I need you to come and speak to me. I need you to come and relate to me. It feels almost like Jacob when he wrestled with God and he said, I'm not leaving until you bless me, God. He's saying, I'm standing and I need to hear from you, God, but I'm going to wait. This is how he models for us the process of experiencing hope. We worship, we wrestle, and we wait. And this is how you and I experience hope. When we're in the middle of our heartache, this is how we experience it. We don't have to invent something new. We don't have to do something different. We get to do what has been modeled for us in the scriptures. This is true for both when the catastrophe comes and the phone call changes everything about your life and the tragedy strikes, and it's also true in the more mundane struggles and burdens that we face. This is how God's people experience hope no matter what's going on in their life. They worship, they wrestle, and they wait. And this is what we need in this moment of our lives. I know because I sit with many of you in my office, or I talk to you on the phone, or I read your prayer requests. I know that many of you are bearing burdens right now. There are people in this congregation who have longed and prayed and waited for years to have a baby, and they still don't have one. There are people who pray for years to have a baby, and then they get pregnant, and they lose the baby by miscarriage. There's people who long for a spouse and don't yet have one. There's people who got a spouse and had a baby, and the baby was born, but that baby grew up to be a teenager or a 20-something who rejected the Lord and wandered off and made a shipwreck of their lives. And there's parents in this church who sit at home at night and they weep and they wait because they don't know if their child is alive, let alone if they're doing well. There's people who are suffering from chronic illness and they're sick and they don't know what's going to happen. And they pray for healing, but they suffer. And what are we supposed to do when that's our lot in life? We're supposed to worship, we're supposed to wrestle, and we're supposed to wait. We worship God, and through the tears we say, God, I know you are good. I know you love me. I know you make promises and you keep them. I know you are holy. I know you are faithful. But this hurts. I don't know how long I can stand up against this. I feel like I'm running out of resources. God, are you going to help me? And then we resolve that I'm not moving. I'm not going to leave the Lord. I'm not going to run away. I'm not going to abandon him. I'm going to wait until he ministers to me, until he speaks to me. This is how we experience hope in the heartache. And this is the privilege of God's people. We don't get to choose whether or not we will experience heartache. We just get to choose whether or not we will experience hope if we're willing to receive it from God. And I'm just telling you, man, this stuff it's not theory, it's practice. There are so many believers in this room that have suffered immensely. They're suffering right now, and they have hope. The most notable example in my heart and my mind right now is Roger Cortman, who's sitting right there on the second row. Roger and Pat have been part of this church since the earliest days. They were part of our launch team. They came to plant this church with us. Roger and Pat have been walking with Jesus about 2 times as long as I have been alive. And over the last few years, Roger's health has deteriorated significantly. And just this last week, after battling cancer now for a year or so, got a result back from the doctor that's not encouraging. The cancer in his lungs is aggressive. And yet Roger is filled with resolute hope. When I sit with Roger and when I talk with him, he's not stuck in despair. Does he cry? Of course he does. Does he weep tears of potentially leaving his family and his children and his grandchildren? Of course he does. But he looks at me and the thing he says to me is, I'm not afraid to die. I'm going to go be with Jesus, but until I do, I want as many people as possible to know him while I'm here. And here's the thing. Roger's not a superhero. He's a Christian. He told me today, I said, Roger, I'm going to talk about you in the sermon. And he said, just make sure people know I'm just a farm kid. He's just a Christian. He's not a superhuman. He knows the same saving hope that is available to every single one of us through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's where we find indestructible hope, that before a holy God, I am forgiven and my future in heaven is secure. So come what may, this world cannot take that which is most precious to me. And my confident expectation for the future is built on the character of the God who promised it. So no matter the heartache, I have hope. May it be so in our lives for the glory of King Jesus. Let's pray.